Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
But Donald Tusk is presenting the EU27's first future relationship speech.
My country, having said this, all of the sectors in order to ensure the best possible outcome. EU solidarity in the foundation on which the future framework will be built on. I consider that the interest of all member states with the UK are all no cherry picking which sector is more or less important in the framework for our future relation. Some sectors, because of their nature, need a differentiated approach too. The principle of 2017 guidelines, which stipulate already that the outcome of the negotiations must be fair and equitable for all member states in the interest of our citizens. We should keep in mind of jobs are linked to the Brexit and depend on the future relations between the UK and the Europe. Have to keep this also in mind. In that respect, we all transition and avoid all kinds of disruptions which could harm trade links which are beneficial to our people on both sides of the channel. That is why I often call exercise. The transition phase is important to manage the exit of the UK also in technical terms. Another principle which is at the heart of the field to ensure the integrity of the internal market. Unfortunately, and we have to know, there will be no exit. Both sides will be losing. Minimizing the losses and limiting the negative impacts as much as possible in the respect is the challenge we all face around the table. The Luxembourg position and pre-European. We will study the current set of guidelines which was issued a few hours ago, and solidarity is a key condition to ensure unity. And unity is the key condition to achieve a pragmatic result too. Financial services are a key interest of my country. Take care of them in the respect of the level playing field and the interest of business and people. I would not like to conclude my short statement without expressing my support. I visited this week also the Taoiseach in Dublin with the people on the island in order to ensure that their daily lives and Ireland can continue in a smooth and frictionless way. Dear President, thank you. Thank you for how we were able also to discuss months since the decision of the UK citizens. We deeply regret the decisions, but we have to respect it. And the most important part was that you were able, under your between the 27 other members. We just will be able to have a soft Brexit, but an intelligent Brexit where we'll be able to find solutions to have a relationship with that country, but on a level playing field, unfair, without giving the impression to other EU citizens than to be outside is more interesting. I said already before, we had a special relations with the UK. Before they were in with a lot of opt-outs. Now they are out and they want a lot of opt-ins. But I'm sure that you, under your leadership, dear Donald, to keep this unity. And so I really would like to thank you for being here also with you during this lunch meeting that we will have. So dziękuję for your work.
Dziękuję. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be back in Luxembourg, and very happy to be here with my colleague and good friend, Prime Minister Bettel, to discuss the agenda of the March European Council. 2 hours ago, I sent the EU 27 member states may draft guidelines for our relations with the UK after Brexit. I am here in Luxembourg to consult the Prime Minister on these guidelines that I hope will be adopted at our European Council in March. And it is not a coincidence that once again I start my consultations ahead of European Council meeting here in Luxembourg with Prime Minister Bettel. I really value your advice, Xavier, you know it. Always very constructive and responsible. My proposal shows that we don't want to build a wall between the EU and Britain. On the contrary, the UK will be our closest neighbour and we want to remain friends and partners also after Brexit. Partners that are as close as possible, just like we have said from the very first day after the referendum. And in this spirit, I propose close cooperation within the following areas. Firstly, as we are confronted with similar security threats, I propose that the EU and the UK continue a common fight against terrorism and international crime. The increasing global instability requires our uninterrupted cooperation in defence and foreign affairs. It is about the security of our citizens, which must be preserved beyond Brexit. Secondly, we invite the UK to participate in EU programmes in the fields of research and innovation, as well as in education and culture. This is key to maintain mutually beneficial and enriching personal networks in these vital areas and for our community of values to prosper also in future. Thirdly, I am determined to avoid that particularly absurd consequence of Brexit, that is the disruption of flights between the UK and the EU. To do so, we must start discussions on this issue as soon as possible. Now, coming to the core of our future economic relationship. During my talks in London last Thursday and in her speech last Friday, Prime Minister Theresa May confirmed that the UK will leave the single market, leave the customs union and leave the jurisdiction of DCJ. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that the only remaining possible model is a free trade agreement. I hope that it will be ambitious and advanced, and we will do our best, as we did with other partners, such as Canada recently. But anyway, it will only be a trade agreement. I propose that we aim for a trade agreement covering all sectors and with zero tariffs on goods. Like other free trade agreements, it should address services. And in fisheries, reciprocal access to fishing waters and resources should be maintained. This positive approach doesn't change the simple fact that because of Brexit we will be drifting apart. In fact, this will be the first FTA in history that loosens economic ties instead of strengthening them. Our agreement will not make trade between the UK and the EU frictionless or smoother. It will make it more complicated and costly than today for all of us. This is the essence of Brexit. To sum up, we will enter the negotiations of the future relations with the UK with an open, positive and constructive mind, but also with realism. From my point of view, the outcome of the negotiations must pass two key tests. The test of balance of rights and obligations. For example, the EU cannot agree to grant the UK the rights of Norway with the obligations of Canada. The test of integrity of the single market. No member state is free to pick only those sectors of the single market it likes, nor to accept the role of the ECJ only when it suits their interest. By the same token, a pick and mix approach for a non-member state is out of the question. We are not going to sacrifice these principles. It's simply not in our interest. Finally, a few words about another topic of the March summit. Following the announcement of President Trump, there is a risk of a serious trade dispute between the United States and the rest of the world, including the EU. President Trump has recently said, and I quote, "Trade wars are good and easy to win." But the truth is quite the opposite. Trade wars are bad and easy to lose. For this reason, I strongly believe that now is the time for politicians on both sides of the Atlantic to act responsibly. Given that President Trump's announcement may have repercussions for our citizens and European businesses, not to mention the global economy, I will propose that the EU leaders have an extraordinary trade debate at the upcoming summit. We should have a clear objective in mind: to keep world trade alive and, if necessary, to protect Europeans against trade turbulence, including by proportionate responses in accordance with the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Adam Fleming from the BBC. President Tusk, you spoke to Mrs. May last week. You read the speech. Do your guidelines come anywhere close to offering what she wants? And on this stuff about President Trump, does the departure of the UK from the EU make it harder for you to deal with issues like this? Prime Minister Bettel, the scope in these guidelines for the UK to change its mind and get a different deal, would you urge the UK to drop its red lines? And also, you're a Prime Minister of a country. Would you accept a deal like this if it was offered to you?
In fact, our guidelines, if you allow me, in fact, our guidelines are our comment on what Prime Minister Theresa May said in her speech last Friday when it comes to substance. And of course it was the main reason of my visit to London to consult with Theresa May before we have prepared the final version of the draft of guidelines, to hear her arguments. One thing must be absolutely clear, and I'm not sure that we are on the same position here, and that there's no possibility to have some sort of exclusive form of single market for some part of our economies. And I hope that during our negotiations and debates also among 27 EU leaders, that we will make this our position more clear for our partners in London. There is also a political context, and I think it must be also absolutely clear for all the partners. I fully understand and of course I respect Theresa May's political objective to demonstrate at any price that Brexit could be a success and was the right choice. But sorry, it is not our objective, of course.
As I told you, there will be no winners. And I'm very honest with you. When I listened to Theresa May's speech the last week, I didn't learn that much more than I knew before. So I still need concrete points, because it's always a framework, but we are still in negotiations. Today I'm very happy, and thank you so much for the compliment to start with your visits in Luxembourg, and for the trust you have in the relations that we have. As I told you before, I met Taoiseach 2 days ago. He still has no answer about border questions. How will be the solution? Is really this USA-Canada model what they want, where he says this is unacceptable for us? So I will have the visit of Prime Minister Sipila on Thursday. I will have the visit of Stéphane Le Pen on Friday. And I will have lunch with Theresa May next week in London. So for me it is important. I'm very happy that we are able to exchange between colleagues. I had a lot of phone calls also this week and last week, really to try to understand also what will be the British position. Because for the moment, I'm very honest with you, it is not clear exactly what they want. And so I will try to get more information out next week when I'm in the UK. But to give the impression that the UK will be the big winner of the Brexit, I told you before, there will be no winner. Nor them, nor us, neither us. So, and if they have red lines, but it's not unilateral, it's negotiation. It's not that they decide and we accept. This is not how we negotiate. The fact is we are around the table and we have rules. And no cherry picking is reality. And it's also, and if we would say now that Europe, it's just now about business and finances, just that, we would not understand what our citizen wants. Because it's also freedom, liberty, freedom of move, freedom of goods, and a whole aspect. And not only businesses and how to be more successful in the economy. This would be, I think, we started in '57, and I'm so sorry to tell that in presence of Donald. He comes from a country where they had not the liberty in '57 we had. And this is because of the European Union now, that we are able, even with, and I'm sorry to say that, to remember also values and human rights in some countries. And this is for me also one of the stones of the European Union, and not only business.
There was a question also about Trump's announcement, and of course in the context of President Trump's announcement on trade, I have no doubt that we, I mean the UK and the EU, that we are still one team in this context, and Brexit has nothing to do with this the obvious idea that free trade is much better than protectionism. Maybe I am naive, but I don't think so.
But I forgot, just to complete
that is the President of the European Council and the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Xavier Bettel, introducing the draft EU 27 words on the future partnership. I mean, that's progress of a sort, something that the government wanted many months ago. We've sort of got to somewhere. Not all of those words, I think, will be welcomed by the Prime Minister. This is essentially the first response from the European Union's leaders, as opposed to the kind of bureaucrats in the Commission. It had been hoped by the Prime Minister and negotiators like David Davis that the sort of response you'd get out of actual EU countries would be far more constructive. There was some constructive language there on the need not to build walls and all that sort of stuff. There's some language in, we've just got hold of the document now, the document talking about zero tariffs on goods. I'm sure the Prime Minister and David Davis will take that as a success. But more generally, on the approach outlined, the specific approach outlined by the PM, kind of pushing back, saying that we're just going to get a free trade deal, saying they're willing to talk about what Donald Tusk said was absurd potential consequences of Brexit, which he suggests could involve flights being delayed or something, but not if, as he has now suggested, that talks on aviation start immediately. But there's some trouble in there. Also, there's a reference to the fact that you can't move on with these talks until the first first phase is ironed out and the objectives are established, and that may well be a reference to the island issue. And there is also a reference to reciprocal rights to fishing waters. That is not where the fishing trade, I think, wants to go. Anyway, let's come back to the panel, which has now become a kind of Prime Minister's questions stroke Luxembourg announcements special panel, but they're multi-talented, so I'm sure we can handle this. Vera Hobhouse, no great surprises, some sort of, again, some nice rhetoric, but within that, some stings in the tail as regards what the Prime Minister was asking for.
I think we had already heard, actually, as the Brexit committee was in Brussels, that the EU is looking at this in a four-pillar approach. One is about security, one is about sort of programs like Erasmus. He's now also talking about the
research exchange, university exchange program.
Where it should be relatively easy to just buy into it. And also then, as I understand it, actually EU citizens' rights and so on and so forth. But then the big thing is the pillar number one, and that's the trade agreement. And there we are stuck again because we don't know anything and have made no progress about customs borders, physical border checks. And so far, I believe the government is still dreaming that we can have this border without a border, and yet whenever we ask the experts, they say wherever there's a customs border, there are physical border checks. No country in the world has currently a border where there's no physical border checks.
So this document, which is the EU27's draft document, we should say, says that there will be frictions on trade, that there will be some economic damage done by this process. Am Incorrigible, what do you make of that? There's a bit of rhetoric that you can hold on to, but generally it isn't a stunning endorsement for the PM's approach announced on Friday.
Well, I think and honestly, it sets out what we would expect to see. Very clear statement on the free trade agreement. As Vera says, in terms of the agency areas, that will be a separate conversation, and I think the Prime Minister was clear that she wanted to engage in those conversations in certain areas too. I think the thing that worries me most is the last line in the document, which is about fishing, which is quite an aggressive statement that they intend to demand continued access. So the Prime Minister
reciprocal.
Yeah, but the Prime Minister was clear that regaining control of our waters was a very important first stage, after which clearly, they're fishing waters that we might, want to welcome other fishermen into as well, but having regained control. So I think there's nothing else specific in there other than the fishing, which is an interesting point to have made from their standpoint. So I hope that'll be an area that can be cleared up very quickly.
But it seems, a key part of the PM's speech was say, we want associate membership of some areas of the single market institutions where we need them. I think it was chemicals, it was pharmaceuticals, the Medicines Agency, Aviation Agency. This seems to reject that, saying you can't be part of parts of the single market.
I think
it's all or nothing.
He's clearly separated the two. Personally, I think the free trade agreement is that broadest, as Vera says, the question of customs, and he specifies no tariffs. This is a very positive statement of intent. But to actually look at those other agency areas, separately, honestly, I don't think that's an issue if they're going to be discussed. They're all issues that are much more than trans-European anyway in terms of aviation, those sorts of things. They are global issues, and this is part of that global framework. So they will no doubt be discussed as a separate part of the poll.
Laura Pidcock, now the opposition are sort of meeting Europe halfway already with a sort of softer vision for Brexit. I mean, you feel you can get that agreed, but...
Well, I don't think it's meeting halfway. I thought it was quite interesting observing the atmosphere there. It was one of ambiguity, a bit of confusion. It almost seemed a bit awkward, the interactions. And I think that reflects what's happening in British politics as well. It's a very confusing situation that the government have put forth. And one thing that really struck me in that conversation was about the free trade agreements and about, all things will be open, essentially. And I just think, well, what does that mean for our public services? Will they be involved in these free trade agreements, and how do we negotiate that? The Labour Party aren't meeting, the European halfway in a sense that we respect the referendum outcome. I represent a Leave constituency. I understand why people voted to leave the European Union. But it was clear there in the statement that you can't have frictionless trade. Joining our customs union is trying to get as close as possible to frictionless trade as we possibly can in this new era post the European Union.
So that's quite an interesting point. I mean, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, you accept that there will be some extra friction in the trade that doesn't currently exist and think that that's OK, that's what people voted for, and we'll gain that back on some other trade deal.
I think the Prime Minister...
Is that fair? Is that...
Well, it will be different, as the Prime Minister set out in her speech on Friday. Yes. Things will be different. Okay. Different doesn't mean automatically a disaster, the end of the world. Different means we will do things a different way. Okay. And she was very clear that, you know, because we have complex supply chains, not only across Europe, but, you know, across the world, but clearly a lot of our manufactured goods are in those complexities.
Now, do you want to keep those? Do you want to keep the situation for those complex supply chains, car industry, exactly as they are at the moment?
Well, the frictionless borders and moving forwards to find ways to make that continued trade happen as smoothly as possible is clearly important to all our business sectors, and there is no reason why it's not, because it works in both directions. It goes from us to the EU27 and back again. So we need to find a way forward, and I have no doubt that actually I thought he was very, you know, open about the fact that this was the conversation they were going to have at the Council next week.
It's a two-way street. She's right. I mean, if they want frictionless, we want frictionless, it'll be frictionless.
I'm always surprised about the naivety with which people talk about these things. My husband has got a manufacturing business, so I know how trade works across Europe, and it is frictionless currently. But as soon as if we have a customs border, even with zero tariffs, we need to declare our goods. We will have hold-ups at the border. These will be picked up. These will be picked up originally by companies, but if it becomes too difficult, and we've talked to companies across actually the Southwest and BMW, for example, they're already quietly building up their plant in Holland. So if this sort of stuff becomes actually too complicated, delays, because supply chains actually have to sort of be processed very, very quickly, what they're doing is they're going to close their plants in Oxford. BMW will survive because they're in Holland. It's our workers who will not be employed.
But the key point is that we will develop a system because it suits the EU27 nations and us to find a system that works smoothly and efficiently. Trusted trader status works across different borders around the globe in a very efficient way.
We're just going to go into comments. Vince Cable, urgent question.
Foreign Commonwealth Office, Minister Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question. I've been asked to respond on behalf of the Foreign Secretary as he's currently at an engagement at the Palace. The Prime Minister has invited the Crown Prince of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman, to visit the United Kingdom. We're delighted to welcome him and his delegation on his first official visit to the UK, taking place from today until Friday. During the visit, the Prime Minister and the Crown Prince will launch a new and ambitious strategic partnership between our two countries, which will allow us to discuss a range of bilateral matters and foreign policy issues of mutual interest. The UK government has a close and wide-ranging relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the UK's third fastest growing market for exports, and we continue to work together to address regional and international issues, including Yemen. The visit will allow for a substantive discussion between the Crown Prince and the Prime Minister on the need for a political resolution to the conflict in Yemen and how to address the humanitarian crisis. The UK fully supports the Crown Prince's social and economic reform programme, Vision 2030. His visit is an opportunity for him to underline his vision of an outward-looking Saudi Arabia, one that embraces a moderate and tolerant form of Islam and a more inclusive Saudi society. This includes greater freedom for women, in line with the recent statements and reforms made by the Crown Prince. We believe these reforms are the best course for Saudi Arabia's future security, stability and prosperity, and it's right that the UK supports the Crown Prince in his Vision 2030 endeavours.
That's the Foreign Office Minister Alistair Burt responding to an urgent question from Vince Cable on Saudi Arabia, reflecting much of what we heard in Prime Minister's questions, exchanges between Jeremy Corbyn and the Prime Minister. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's just come back to the panel. We were just sort of getting somewhere on these European Council exchanges about the issue. So kind of everyone now accepts that Anne-Marie Trevelyan was saying that should be no... There's a mutual interest in there being no friction. Via Hobhouse was saying, well, that's just the rules, them's the rules. Where you're suggesting being in a customs union, so you think you have a solution to this, but this will mean we can't sign independent trade deals, but you calculate that's the better solution.
Well, I think if we want as frictionless trade as possible, a customs union is the best possible outcome that we can have in this situation. And if we look at the threats that Donald Trump has made on steel, for example, and on tariffs on steel of 25%, to do that alone as a nation, to kind of counteract that alone, would be quite difficult. It is much better to be on bloc, whilst recognising that the the nation voted to leave the European Union. One thing I think that's really striking is this propensity to say it will be doomsday if we come out of the European Union, because that is letting the British government very much off the hook. I think it's much more nuanced position than that. The British government will, from this date forward, when we leave, be responsible and wholly responsible for what happens within an interconnected world, and therefore I strongly believe that a customs union is the best way forward.
It's kind of both, isn't it? It's kind of it'll be doomsday, or it'll be fine because it just will be. And you're like, but we're now getting down to some brass tacks about exactly what we prioritise. Now, you guys have not prioritised doing future trade deals as an independent UK because he's going to stay in a customs union. So there's the policy. Now, clearly, Andrew Trevelyan disagrees with that, but it's a fair point. I mean, Tusk just made it, didn't he, about Donald Tusk, who's the great hope for a big new free trade deal, has just said free trade deals, trade wars are good and they're easy to win. I mean, it's like kind of, dancing with a lion. Well, what's going on here? Well,
he was talking about the potentially, a battle coming with Trump, and clearly wanted to set a marker there as he had the opportunity, and why would you not? I think that was quite sensible of him.
But we're going to have to be. I mean, what's going? If there's a giant UK-EU trade war, is the sort of Brexit answer to this?
I don't think
we're going to be on the US side.
He was directing that very clearly at Trump.
If there's a US-EU trade war, are we like on the America's side as the Brexiters?
As he said, it would be a global trade war, US versus everybody else. So we're looking at WTO and all sorts of international organisations all wading in on that one. And let's hope that the wisdom of the US Congress and Senate will bring some stability to Trump's yet again slightly excitable statement.
In 3 or 4 years' time, he still wants to be president. He's going to run again.
Apparently so.
If we've done a free trade deal with the US, are we going to be aligned with Donald Trump's America against Europe? Is that the vision? Is that a Brexit vision that you buy into?
Free trade deals are made, for the things that you choose to trade. So, they grow. So you have multi-layered trade deals. These things develop. If we can negotiate a free trade deal with the States, we'll start at a level where there will be an agreement.
But I think
steel may not be it if Trump's involved.
Sorry, I think it's important, and this is a short point, to understand the political motivations behind this, to not being within a customs union or the single market, which the Conservatives have clearly ruled out, that actually they believe in freedom of the market, and that is a different political position.
But hang on, if we were in a customs union, we could cut. If we weren't in a customs union, we could cut a nice deal with Donald in the White House.
Well, I'm saying I have a different political position than Andrew Trevelyan.
We're on the same page on that.
Hang on, every trade deal will have to come together to a mutual interest. So nobody in a trade agreement, whether that is within the European Union or with America, where one side will dominate the other. That's the whole point about trading. We misunderstand that this sort of idea about sovereignty is, there's a sovereign country that can dictate something to the other. It's a pooled sovereignty. Once you have a trade deal, each country has to give up something. And the question is whether we want to give up something to America or something to Europe.
People from your political backdrop have no interest in signing free trade deals because you don't like free trade. You'd be on a demo against them.
No, what I'm thinking, right, is how is somebody in concert, for example, where I represent, what are they thinking of this conversation? For me, sovereignty is about what propensity does a worker have, for example, to negotiate their own pay terms and conditions. Under this government, very little. So if we're talking about sovereignty, let's start talking about the real birthplace of sovereignty, and that's with the people of this nation, and that falls with the British government.
But I would also say sovereignty, if we're talking about this, is what people actually experience on the ground. So sovereignty, to me, goes right down to the local level. And currently, if I may say, we were talking about local government, the erosion of local government...
Well, hang on. Just really quickly, what if there's no signed trade deal? Give me a 10-second answer. What if Parliament rejects the trade, the withdrawal deal?
Well, the Prime Minister was clear when she was asked the question on Friday that, no deal is still better than a bad deal, and therefore that no deal is always going to be an option.
Well, it would. I think it would be terrible, but we have to vote on. We have to vote on
3 seconds.
An orderly exit is in the interest of everybody.
Okay, thank.
This is Sky News. The headlines today. The EU warns Theresa May that trade frictions are inevitable after Brexit.
Our agreement will not make trade between the UK and the EU frictionless or smoother. It will make it more complicated and costly than today for all of us. This is the essence of Brexit.
The government holds crisis talks as a Russian double agent and his daughter remain critically ill in hospital after suspected poisoning.
The Cobra meeting comes as diplomatic relations sour between Russia and the UK, with Boris Johnson threatening sanctions.
But Russia retaliates and says the poisoning claims are being used to whip up the anti-Russian campaign in Britain.
Well, we do know more about the substance, and the police will be making a further statement this afternoon in order to share some of that.
Well, live in Salisbury, as counter-terrorism officers extend the cordon around areas of the investigation, but maintain that they are keeping an open mind.
Also this hour, Europe rebukes President Trump on tariffs, warning him that trade wars are costly and easy to lose.
Theresa May to raise humanitarian concerns as Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince embarks on a 3-day visit to the UK.
And a snowboarder captures his miraculous escape from an avalanche in the French Alps.
Good afternoon. The European Commission President Donald Tusk has warned Britain that there will be trade frictions after Brexit. He was giving his response to Theresa May's speech last week, in which she outlined plans for a post-Brexit relationship.
Mr Tusk said that EU would work towards a free trade agreement on goods, but he warned any arrangement would make trade more complicated and costly for everyone.
No member state is free to pick only those sectors of the single market it likes, nor to accept the role of the ECJ only when it suits their interest. By the same token, a pick-and-mix approach for a non-member state is out of the question. We are not going to sacrifice these principles. It's simply not in our interest.
Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our Europe correspondent, Michelle Clifford, in Brussels. But first, to our political editor, Faisal Islam, in Westminster. It seems that the reaction to Theresa May's speech is that it is improbable what she is trying to achieve. Because of Brexit, we will be drifting apart, says Donald Tusk, not coming closer together.
Yes, it's kind of what we expected. I'm pretty sure it's what Downing Street would have expected from this. They always said that this speech and the road to Brexit speeches we've heard from various members of the Cabinet were a kind of starting point for the negotiation. I think they will take something from some of the rhetoric, the specific reference, for example, for zero tariffs on goods trade. They always said that that was in the mutual interest of both the remaining EU and the United Kingdom. But I don't think anyone really expected that that was a likely outcome of a negotiated Brexit deal anyway. On the ideas floated by the Prime Minister, very specifically to remain part of the EU institutions as regards chemicals and aviation and also medicines, the Medicines Agency for Pharmaceuticals, it seems like that has been rebuffed in the text that was released and the words that we heard there from Donald Tusk. They repeated this idea of no cherry-picking of the single market. We're very specific about that yes, a free trade deal along the lines of Canada and a bit more can be done. But if we in the UK interpret that as being keeping the best bits of the single market for those sectors where we need access to 500 million people, then that is not what is on offer. It is a draft. Maybe there'll be some movement. There was also some... I mean, Donald Tusk kind of hesitated for about 5 or 10 seconds when asked about what he had heard directly from the Prime Minister when he met her in Downing Street last week. It seemed to be that he was communicating that the expectations of the UK government were rather higher than what was likely to be delivered in a straightforward free trade deal. He also, I think, suggested when he said he respected and understood that it was the Prime Minister's objective to make Brexit a success, he said, "I'm sorry, it's not our objective." So you start to see a far tougher negotiation. I think the other couple of things that I pick out of this, I mean, on the plus side, there is a willingness to sort out what could be a mess in aviation as regards the legal rights to fly. Instant negotiations on that. That is good news for Chris Grayling. But on the more negative side, the suggestion that there is now some sort of causality between signing off in a legal text, the agreements are already made, for example, on Ireland. Also a reference to reciprocal access to fishing waters. As we've heard from some Tory Brexiter MPs, they aren't happy with that. That's not what the fishing community, not a huge sector in terms of GDP, but a kind of emotionally important sector for many MPs, politically important too. That's not what they are after. So some language to work with, but on the substance of what the Prime Minister asked for in terms of special access for certain sectors where the UK thrives in the single market, that firmly rebutted. But perhaps there's some wriggle room from other European leaders to work with.
OK, Faisal, thanks very much. As Faisal is talking there, we're hearing from Prime Minister May. She's saying that she wants to achieve in future relations with the EU has already been set out and that this is a negotiation. So perhaps suggesting that not surprised by the sort of response she's been getting. Let's cross to Michelle Clifford, who's in Brussels for us. And Michelle, there were some conciliatory tones, weren't there? You know, it's about minimising losses. We don't want to build a wall.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that has been the position of the European Union from the start. Michel Barnier is famous for saying we're not in the business of punishing the UK. We're not happy with what they're doing, but we want to get as good an arrangement as possible. And that was certainly repeated by Donald Tusk today. But it doesn't change the fact that they're not acquiescing to some of the really significant demands that the UK are making, particularly, for example, in financial services. We're going to hear from the Chancellor Philip Hammond in relation to that. Britain wants to have a bespoke deal in terms of financial services. And I thought it was quite interesting. Alongside Donald Tusk today was Xavier Bettel, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And he was very firmly moving away from any special deal for Britain. And he said, in my country, financial services are very important and there shouldn't be a special arrangement or special access. And I think that's telling because the European Union is constantly putting up this position of unity, and that was something certainly that Prime Minister Bettel reinforced today, that we are unified. But you have to remember that different countries have different needs and potentially want different arrangements with Britain. And so I think it is on the issue of trade where differences between the 27 have the potential to be exposed. But Prime Minister Bettel said that there would be no winners from Brexit, not them, the UK, and not us. He said basically it was all about now minimising the damage. Let's have a listen into what he had to say.
If we would say now that Europe is just now about business and finances, just that, we would not understand what our citizen wants, because it's also freedom, liberty, freedom of move, freedom of goods, and a whole aspect, and not only businesses and how to be more successful in the economy. This would be, I think, we started in '57, and I'm so sorry to tell that in presence of Donald. He comes from a country where they had not the liberty in '57 we had. And this is because of the European Union now, that we are able, even with, and I'm sorry to say that, to remember also values and human rights in some countries. And this is for me also one of the stones of the European Union, and not only business.
So Prime Minister Bettel there being passionate about the virtue of the European Union. Obviously, the other members sad that Britain is leaving. And the meeting or the press conference today from Donald Tusk and Xavier Bettel followed the publication of these draft guidelines. Now, those guidelines, we believe they're only 6 pages long. Those guidelines are going to be pored over by the EU 27. There may be some revisions, but at the end of this month, 22nd of March, 22nd, 23rd, the members of the European Councils, the leaders of the EU 27, will come together and will have to sanction those guidelines to present to Michel Barnier going forward.
Michelle, thanks very much for that. Well, we will hear the UK response to all that shortly. Chancellor Philip Hammond's speech due around 2:15 about Brexit will bring to you live on Sky News.
OK, let's return to our top story, that the European Council Commission President Donald Tusk has said that when it comes to trade, that it will not be frictionless come Brexit. Joining me to talk about this is Caroline Wheeler from the Sunday Times and Ben Glaze from the Daily Mirror. Caroline, Ben, really good to see you both. Thanks for joining us. Caroline, if I could firstly start with you, your reaction to Donald Tusk's comments that there will not be frictionless trade come Brexit.
I don't think it's desperately surprising. I mean, we're in the middle of a negotiation where everybody is trying to get the best deal. So they're trying to sort of use their bargaining chips as best they can in order to get the best deal for the 27. At the same time, we saw Theresa May lay out exactly what she wanted to see happening with this deep and special partnership moving forward in her speech on Friday, talking specifically about having that special security partnership as well as a free trade deal. They're hitting back today and saying very clearly, you know, you can't cherry pick and have a sort of sector by sector trade deal. In particular, we're interested in financial services, and we'll see the Chancellor saying a bit more about that later today. But Downing Street seem to be fairly relaxed about this at the moment, talking about it as being very much a draft text and saying, you know, let's see what happens when we see the kind of full text later. They still assert the idea that they want to get a very ambitious trade deal. So there's still a lot more to come in this saga.
Ben, a Prime Minister spokesman said that the Prime Minister has set out what she wants to achieve with the future relationship with the European Union. Problem is, we heard from Xavier Bettel, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. He said that he's not any clearer in terms of what's going to happen moving forward.
Well, yeah, I mean, today we've seen it's Brexit chickens coming home to roost, really, for the Prime Minister. To coin one of her favourite phrases, nothing has changed. We knew it was going to be difficult. Number 10 are relaxed about this. They're stressing, you know, these are draft guidelines. And, yeah, with Brussels saying you can't go cherry-picking, well, you know, we have been told that all along. Yet the Prime Minister on Friday was very clear that she wants to cherry-pick when she says every trade agreement that the EU has ever struck has been a bespoke trade agreement, which obviously involves elements of cherry-picking. Well, she's correct on that. And in the next hour or so, we're going to hear more from Philip Hammond about how he particularly wants to cherry-pick good access for financial services, which, of course, is such a big part of our economy.
Caroline, Mr Tusk said that he doesn't want the EU to build a wall. Is a wall inevitable if there are friction when it comes to trade?
I think it's difficult to say at this time. I mean, they've been very clear today when they're talking about America, for example, that we don't want to end up in a kind of situation where we're in a kind of race to the bottom and a trade war with America. And, of course, they won't want to see the same happening with the UK either. So there's going to have to be some give and take on both sides. But we're just not at that stage now where they're willing to give significant ground on this. And David Davis has always been quite clear on this, that it will come down to the wire, that, you know, will be lots of kind of backwards and forwards until we actually get that deal that we want. And hopefully they're still hopeful that we will get a deal that we want and won't be forced to walk away with nothing.
Ben?
Well, yeah, I mean, the UK, I don't think we will be forced to walk away with nothing. Will we get everything we want? No, the Prime Minister said that again on Friday. It was a sort of bid, really, to try and unite the Brexiteers and Remainers in her own party as much as in the country by saying there is going to have to be compromise. And it's not just compromise within the Conservative Party. The government's going to have to compromise over what it wants. The Prime Minister seems to be accepting that now, albeit 20 months too late. And she does want give and take. She wants Brussels to compromise as well. So when we get the March Council EU summit at the end of this month, that's going to be another key moment then when, for Brexit, and we'll see to what extent, really, the EU is prepared to compromise to strike a deal with Britain, albeit, you know, it'll be the interim transition deal. But we'll get a better idea then, more so than from these draft guidelines, of exactly to what extent EU is prepared to compromise.
Yeah, Caroline, Mr Tusk said we'll all be poorer as a result.
Again, I mean, this is part of a bargaining position that they have adopted. You know, they want to get the best deal they possibly can for their members vis-a-vis, you know, Britain. And I think that this is the message that they're trying to get home. It's a kind of chicken who's going to blink first kind of scenario. And as Ben said quite clearly, we won't know very much more about how much of a compromise there's going to be until later on this month when we have that European Council meeting.
What can we expect to hear from the Chancellor when he speaks this afternoon, Ben?
Well, he's going to be setting out what he wants. I mean, this is the last of the Road to Brexit speeches, which have been cruelly dubbed the Road to Nowhere speeches. But yeah, Philip Hammond's going to be the last of the big cabinet ministers to come out and set out in their policy areas what they want from the EU withdrawal agreement. And the Chancellor, you know, he's the most pro-EU member of the cabinet, really. He's the one pushing for a soft Brexit, and he sees the figures spreadsheet, Phil. He knows quite how bad a no-deal situation, particularly for the financial services sector, what an impact that would have on the economy of the United Kingdom, but also on the Treasury coffers. And we talk about the £350 million a week for the NHS. Well, there won't be £350 million a week for the NHS, full stop. But there certainly won't be anything like that if we can't get a deal by which financial services can trade with the EU, because they are such a massive part of our economy.
Caroline, I guess one of the areas where you thought that the EU27 would have different interests would be on the issue of trade. But again, we heard from Xavier Bettel there, and he seemed to give the impression, at least, that they're all very much standing together on the issue of trade, and the countries wouldn't be drawn apart.
Yeah, I mean, that was always one of the sort of tactics that we thought we would be seeing employed a lot more at this sort of phase, the kind of divide and rule idea, that we would be seeing a bit more pushback from those individual countries. But they do all seem to be speaking from the same voice at this moment. And there is a kind of, if you think about the fact that we are one of the biggest contributors to the EU's budget, there's a lot to be gained from the 27 in terms of getting the best deal, for them vis-à-vis us. So they are all speaking from the same voice.
Do you think that will last, that they will continue to be speaking with the same voice?
I think, again, I mean, as I was saying about, getting to the end of the road here, I mean, there is still a long way to go, even though it is only a year until we actually get to that sort of 2019 break at the moment. I mean, there's been moments of dissension, and you've thought, will this be the moment where you get more sort of talk from the sort of German car manufacturers, for example? I think it's inevitable, ultimately, that there might be some pushback, but at the moment, clearly, the discipline that they've been using is working to their advantage.
Ben, do you think it will last?
I'm not sure it will, actually. I think some of the smaller countries and some of the countries which rely on Britain more for trade than other EU members, I think they might start putting a bit of pressure on France and Germany, not anytime soon, but certainly as the negotiations progress, they might try and pressure France and Germany into compromise and say, well, look, if we don't get a deal with Britain, look what it will do to our economy. Say if you're, I don't know, Holland or Denmark or something like that, or Belgium, and you might, you haven't got a massive influence when you think of the Franco-German axis, but if you get a few of the smaller nations clubbing together to put pressure on Berlin and Paris, then you might get a situation where France and Germany have to compromise at the, at the behest of some of those smaller countries.
Interesting stuff. Ben Glaze, Caroline Wheeler, thanks for your time.